Ancient History 206, Lesson 9, the Indus Valley Civilization. Probably a civilization that most of us don't think much about or know much about because it's kind of one of those uh, uh, ancient history mysteries that we're still trying to crack. Um, Let me get my control panel up here. All right. So, what we know about this civilization, as you can see, it covers modern Pakistan and Afghanistan and just the northwest corner of India. Okay. They developed a system of weights and measures. They developed the use of a seal made from faience or steatite. They also innovated methods of metallurgy, including copper, tin, bronze, and lead. They mass-produced ceramic pottery goods. Their communities were laid out in a grid pattern. How many of you guys have been to Phoenix, Arizona? It's one of the most well-planned road systems that I've ever seen. If you look at it on a map, there is a major street that is numbered that goes horizontally up the city, and then vertically there are lettered streets. I could be getting letters and numbers backward, but there are lettered streets, main thoroughfares that run through the city, and it becomes really easy, almost like on a grid pattern, to tell someone where to go, right? It's near the corner of this, and that puts it into a grid where you can get in the vicinity very easily. The mass production of ceramic pottery goods is one of the indications of how big their trade was. This is a people that spent a lot of time trading goods. This is what the map looks like in the early to mid Bronze Age. Okay, lots of communities. Actually, there's a total of 70 so far that we've discovered. The two biggest ones are Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. In fact, this area is this civilization is sometimes called the Harappan civilization, as well as being known as the Indus Valley civilization. What's really interesting is that modern India, which takes its name from the Indus River and possibly is derived from this civilization, modern India makes up a very small portion of the geography of the Indus Valley. As to where is the Indus Valley in relation to other great powers of the time, such as the Mesopotamian region and Egypt, well, you may recall this little section north of the Persian Gulf is the area of the Akkadian Empire. Here's the Sumerian kingdom down here. And up here is where the Akkadian Empire at least attempted to expand. And we're not really sure how many holdings they actually took and how much of those holdings they were able to hold and for how long. So north of the Persian Gulf, northwest of the Persian Gulf, is the kingdom of Akkad that we talked about yesterday. Well, there's Mohenjo-Daro, there's Harappa, right in the area of Pakistan, and there's the Persian Gulf. So literally, what you could do is travel down the Indus Valley River to the Arabian Sea, and then up the Persian Gulf, and that little black dot right there where my cursor is pointing, that's Ur. Ur. You may remember that Ur is familiar to us because it is a Persian Gulf town in the very lower southeast, southwest portion of Sumer. It's also famous because it's the city of Abraham, right? So when Abraham was a young man, he may have been able to go down to the marketplace and buy pottery, metal, uh, other items of trade that had come from the Indus Valley civilization. Okay. And then, of course, from the Arabian Sea, you can make your way to Egypt as well. Um, but the weird thing is, there's no evidence of trade between Egypt and the Indus Valley directly. It seems that they didn't go that far west. The Mesopotamian region was as far as they traded, but then some of their goods would get traded to Egyptians by the Mesopotamian peoples. So um, that's an interesting thing. This, of course, is a picture of Mohenjo-Daro from the ruins that we've excavated. There's another look at that same area. This is Harappa. So this one is Mohenjo-Daro, and you can see how the city is laid out. In the same area of the Indus Valley, the other city is Harappa, and this is what we found at Harappa. The architecture of the two cities is strikingly similar. They had it figured out how their communities were going to be developed and how they were going to be laid out architecturally, and how the social interactions of the people fit into this grid. Has anybody here ever been to the Indus Valley? Bummer. I was hoping one of you had some pictures. Um, all right, so Harappa. So the city has been known as the Harappan civilization for a long time. More recently, the alternative name Indus Valley Civilization has become more popularized. Harappa covers about 370 acres. That's a pretty big city for the time. 23,500 residents. Clay brick houses. In all, 70 Harappan cities have been uncovered since the initial discoveries of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. For a long time, actually, historians and archaeologists thought that these were the only two cities. And then, as more excavations took place, as we dug deeper in different places, as the sands shifted, we found 68 more smaller communities. So this is a pretty big deal, the Harappan civilization. It's also a very mysterious and enigmatic place because we just simply don't know very much about it. Here's another look at Mohenjo-Daro. 250 acres of land, 40,000 people. You notice the difference in the population density? 370 acres, 23,500. Mohenjo-Daro, 250 acres, 40,000 people. So with considerably less land, considerably more people. We also found in Mohenjo-Daro that there was channeled sanitation. Channeled meaning it was able to move out of the city. They had gutters, excuse me, built into the roads, so that human waste and garbage could flow out that was poured into those gutters. They also had a public bathing pool and they had a large granary. Obviously, if you're going to feed 40,000 people, you're going to need to have a ready supply of grain. Not sure why I have that map in there. There we go. They were an Acadian trade partner. The Meluha, from which ships came to trade with Sargon the Great, was India, where a great civilization had grown up. But from this great civilization, not a single personality has survived. In the 700 years between Manuvishnu and Sargon, the villages along the Indus had turned into a network of cities. The people who lived in these cities were related, not too distantly, to the Elamites or Persians, just as the Amorites and Akkadians were offshoots of the same migrating group of people. So the original inhabitants of the Elamite plain north of the Arabian Sea and the people who built cities along the Indus seem to have come from the same original stock. This is about all we know. That's Bauer from your assigned reading this week. Um, it's also interesting to note that they also traded with China and Persia and several places in between, but they did not directly trade with Egypt. Akkad and other Mesopotamian civilizations sold goods from the Indus Valley to Egypt. Isn't it interesting to think that this entire other civilization is rising up during the time of Sargon? It's well established, all the way on the northern side of India, or what we would call India today. Um, According to historians, this civilization and Egypt were semi parallel in their development, but they both were founded after the Mesopotamian civilizations. So Sumer is older than Egypt, and Sumer is older than the Indus Valley civilizations. I think that's interesting because it fits into the biblical story of how the nation spread from a place in Shinar, which is Sumer. It's in Mesopotamia between the two rivers. We spread from there throughout the world. So it makes sense that the first civilizations would be closer to the area of ancient Sumer, Eridu, Ur, Uruk, and that later civilizations, even ancient ones, would have come afterward. So I do think historians are on the right track with that. Um, it is strange to me that we don't see more civilizations closer to Ararat, but it may be that they intentionally migrated very quickly in the days of Moses, in the days of Noah, to get to the place where the Fertile Crescent was, and who knows, perhaps to see if it was still there. We don't know how much of the geography changed because of the flood. We know that the sea levels would have been higher. We know that the rivers would have been larger, wider because of the additional water. We know that much of the landscape would have been just washed in the flood, like large mounds of dirt, large hills that are not volcanic in nature would have probably, some of them would have been completely moved or even leveled to make flat ground. Places where there were not hills before, hills would have come up, right? Because so much water. Um, the the Indus Valley civilization, though, is an example of how from Ararat down into the Mesopotamian region between the Euphrates and the Tigris, civilization was born after the flood, reborn, and then it spread to North Africa, and then it spread to below the Persian Gulf. Then it spread east toward China. Um, then it spread northwest toward Asia Minor and Europe. Um, and it's really, I think, interesting that ancient history records that pattern of migration, even though they seem to have their dates inflated. So here is the Indus script, also known as the Harappan script. What's interesting to me about this is at this time, their neighbors to the northwest in Mesopotamia are still using cuneiform, and their neighbors to the far west in Egypt are still using hieroglyphics. This actually almost seems to be like an alphabet. By the way, does anybody recognize any of the symbols on that chart? Does anything stand out to you? Which ones? Yes, and swastika is exactly what they called it. The swastika is an ancient occult symbol from the Indian region that migrated to different parts of the world. And the German Fuhrer, Adolf Hitler, and his inner circle were obsessed with the occult. That's for the same reason that they were trying to find biblical artifacts. They were also trying to find artifacts of significant mystical value in occult religions. Um, the swastika is actually an Indian design, but it has multiple designs. One of those designs is what looks like an upside down broken cross surrounded by a circle. And in modern America, that's often referred to as what? It's a peace symbol. But actually, it's an occultic symbol, much like this swastika. It's just a different variety of swastika. Both are occult symbols. Um, the Germans did co opt it, and some have suggested maybe it's because this is made with two S's. They're not really S's because they don't curve, but perhaps the two S's were important. Um, I don't know that I can find real evidence that that's why the Germans chose it. It seems more to me it had to do with their obsession with the occult. Um, but what's really interesting about this, nobody can read it. We still haven't figured out the language. The term Indus script, also Harappan script, refers to short strings of symbols associated with the Indus Valley civilization in use during the mature Harappan period between the 26th and 20th centuries BC. So, how come we can't read it? In spite of many attempts at decipherments and claims, it is as yet undeciphered. Why? Because the underlying language is unknown, and the lack of a bilingual makes the decipherment unlikely pending significant new finds. So, who wants to be the smart one today and tell us what a bilingual means in this context? Um, well, you're on the right track. That would be multilingual. Bilingual means two, but basically, what we're referring to here is a bilingual inscription, right? If we could find somewhere that an Akkadian script and a Harappan script were side by side with the same message in two languages, that would help us unlock the Indus script and the language of the Indus Valley. What's interesting is we've had this happen, right? Everyone remembers the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone, because it was written in three languages, helped us to understand languages we didn't understand very well. Okay. The first publication of a Harappan seal dates to 1873. 1873 is only 101 years before I was born. We have not been studying this culture for a long time. It was in the form of a drawing by Alexander Cunningham. No, Alexander Cunningham was not an ancient Harappan. He was an archaeologist, and he drew a picture of a seal that he had discovered. Since then, well over 4,000 symbol-bearing objects have been discovered, some as far afield as Mesopotamia. In early 70s, Iravadam Mahadevan published a corpus and concordance of Harappan writing listing about 3,700 seals and about 417 distinct signs in specific patterns. The average size of writing is 5 signs, and the largest text in a single line is 14 signs. He also established the direction of writing as right to left, which is common in the East, right? We write left to right in the West. They write right to left. Some early scholars, starting with Cunningham in 1877, thought that the script was the archetype of the Brahmi script used by the Ashoka. Cunningham's ideas were supported by G.R. Hunter, Iravadam Mahadevan, and a minority of scholars continue to argue for the Indus script as the predecessor of the Brahmic family. However, most scholars disagree, claiming instead that the Brahmi script derived from the Aramaic script. Here's an interesting question. Who's writing backwards? Is it the Western world that writes backwards, or is it the Eastern world that writes backwards? Yeah, it's us, because they invented writing. The first alphabets come from the ancient East. So it's kind of hard for us to say they're doing it backward when they did it first. Yes. Interestingly enough, that's true in all of Europe, but it's not true on the Isle of Great Britain. They drive on the correct side of the road, or so I'm told. Um, Here's a quote from Bauer. We have history complete with approximate dates. Cities, industries, and arts, John Kay complains, but absolutely no recorded events. And barring some not very helpful bones, no people. 1, we can speculate that the cities had kings. One of the only distinctive portraits found in the ruins is the statue of a bearded man wearing an ornate robe and a headpiece, his eyes half closed and his face expressionless. Perhaps he is the king of Mohenjo-Daro, where his portrait was discovered. The city has a series of buildings that appear to be barracks or servants' quarters, suggesting that a king or priest king may have needed a staff to run his affairs. 2, but maybe there was no king at all. No clay tablets, texts written on papyrus, or any other examples of record keeping exist in the Harappan ruins, even though the writing system, whatever it is, seems capable of producing them. 3, and it is difficult to see how priests, kings, and bureaucrats could carry on their business without feeling the need to keep track of their doings. So we have no laws, we have no records, we have no correspondence that we can decipher. But there don't seem to be enough written documents, written, tablets to indicate that they were record keeping, which is odd. It's possible that most of those would have been destroyed so that the clay tablets could be broken into pieces, ground up, and reused in new clay. But it's not what we see everywhere else, right? Once writing develops, we start to see writings, we start to see recordings of events, we start to see histories of great battles. So why do you think that we have no evidence of government, of bureaucracy, or of record keeping in a large scale? That's a good point. It could have disintegrated. It's also um, problematic because papyrus in the early part of uh, the Indus Valley civilization, papyrus hadn't been invented yet. This was at the time that the Akkadians were keeping records on clay tablets. That's how the kings corresponded with each other. So while papyrus doesn't last forever, and certainly paper doesn't, the clay tablets last a really, really, really long time. So I have a theory about their societal structure that I can't prove, and further archaeology may prove me right or it may prove me completely wrong. But my theory is I don't think that this was a that this was a people of city states like the Sumerians were and the Akkadians after them. I don't think it was a kingdom in the sense that Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt were a kingdom and became a united kingdom. Um, I think that their entire culture is built around commerce, trade. They're a merchant society. And so government such as it was probably made up of merchant guilds. The prominent merchants would essentially be the ones who would come together and collect some form of taxation to build the city. That everything in their city was built around the idea of being a merchant population, which is why they're so famous for their trade. You have any thoughts on that? No? Okay. So while the Indus, That makes sense. So Britannica says, while the Indus or Harappan civilization may be considered the culmination of a long process indigenous to the Indus Valley, a number of parallels exist between developments on the Indus River and the rise of civilization in Mesopotamia. It is striking to compare the Indus with this better known and more fully documented region and to see how closely the two coincide with respect to the emergence of cities and of such major concomitants of civilization as writing, standardized weights and measures, and monumental architecture. Yet nearly all the earlier writers have sensed the Indianness of the civilization, even when they were largely unable to articulate it. So, there were many societal constructs and even architectural similarities that were in common with the Elamites or Persians and the Mesopotamians in between the rivers. But they were culturally already divergent enough that you can sense their Indianness, that they are the ancestors or antecedents of Indian culture even today. It's fascinating to me when I look at this. I of course I think like a historian, right? That would be reasonable to expect, I would think. But when I look at this, what I see is each of these civilizations would have been able to learn something from each other's technological advances, right? So here we are at Mohenjo-Daro, the largest population-wise community, and Harappa, the largest land-based community in the Indus Valley. Right up here at the Persian Gulf, on this side of the Tigris and over the mountains, you have the ancient Elamites, and here you have the ancient Mesopotamians, the Sumerians. What's interesting to me about that, if we take a moment to change windows, and we look at Genesis chapter 10. In Genesis chapter 10, we see the table of nations, right? And when we look at the table of nations, we come down to this group of people known as the sons of Ham. And then further down, we come to the group of people known as the sons of Shem. So let's take a look at some of these. It says of Nimrod, the son of Cush, who was Ham's son. So this would be Ham's great grandson, Nimrod, that the beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. So this people group right in here are his kingdom. But it also says Asher, who went out of that land and he builded Nineveh and the city of Rehoboth and Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, the same as a great city. So north on our map, if I can switch back for a moment, north on our map is North Persian Gulf, North Mesopotamia is the area of Ashur or Assyria. Down here is what would later be known as Babylonia. This whole area is the Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, with the Tigris here and the Euphrates here. Um, and over here, you have the Elamites, the Persians. It seems, from what we know of history and what we know of the region, that the people migrated from the area of Sumer, the Babylonia area, to the Elamites over here in what would become Persia, and then tribes began to move down toward this valley, the Indus Valley. Valleys are often a nice place to live when you've got mountains and water, and it's a nice place to be is in the valley, right? Um, so what that brings to my mind is, who does it look like then would be the ancestor of these people? Are they uh, are they Semitic? Are they Hamitic? Um, when we go down to Shem, we see that the children of Shem begin with Elam and Asher and Arphaxad. Okay, um, Elam is the father of the Elamites. Those would be the Persians that gave the name to the Persian Gulf, right? The Elamites were told, according to Bauer and other historians and archaeologists, are related to the people of the Indus Valley. So this is a Semitic people in India. Um, also note Asher and Arphaxad. Arphaxad clearly settled here because we find his descendant Abraham in Ur of the Chaldees. That doesn't necessarily mean that all of his descendants stayed here, but he surely had a group of people here, and we know there's long been a Semitic people in the region. But also notice that Lud and Aram, who go out elsewhere. Aram, of course, is the father of Uz, and Uz is the city where Job came from. What's interesting, though, about this is the people of Mesopotamia also included peoples who were Hamites, because the descendants of Cush included those who were in Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And Asher, who was not a Hamite, but is recorded as one of the sons of Shem, went out from where the Hamites were to found his city or his kingdom in Assyria. Now, obviously, these people groups didn't stay completely genetically divided, right? You have a whole bunch of people living in the same area, and obviously they're going to intermarry. But what's interesting is, with the patterns that paleontologists, archaeologists, and historians tell us about, ring true with the Table of Nations. There's evidence in the archaeological record and even in our genetic history that this migration pattern did happen. The Bible is verified by the science. I find that interesting. So we pick up back where we were. All right. So we asked the question, where is the bureaucracy There is one bearded man statue wearing an ornate robe and a headpiece with his eyes half closed and his face expressionless. What do you think? Is he more likely a priest king, a king, or something else? Absolutely not. Idle speculation. What if he's just the architect? What if he was the master builder over the project of building the city? What if he was the leader of the trade guild and that was the only form of government they had? What if he was a king? Maybe they just thought he was pretty. Maybe he was a famous actor in the ancient thespian arts. Um, Maybe he was a wealthy man, and when he died, his family made a statue of him to commemorate him. Or maybe, go with me on this, maybe the statue is not of anybody in particular, right? Sometimes you make a statue and it's a statue that isn't of an individual person. It's, a statue of the merchant, for example, right? Um, we don't know. That's the short answer. We just don't know. But it's really odd that we see so little evidence of what we would normally think of as trappings of civilization, like government. But they seem to have a pretty well run civilization. So if they had kings, we don't know about them, or maybe they didn't have them at all. So back to this. While the Indus or Harappan civilizations may be considered the culmination of a long process indigenous to the Indus Valley, a number of parallels exist between the developments on the Indus River and the rise of civilization in Mesopotamia. It's those similarities that intrigue me. Um, and I think it's because of two things. One is because of the trade that took place through over the generations, over the centuries. But I think another reason is because these people all migrated from the same basic area. And some of the early civilizations were already forming before the Tower of Babel, when the languages were divided and the people parted from each other as a result of the division of languages. So I think the basic elements, the basic roots of civilization all come back to the seeds that were planted in the post-flood Mesopotamian world, out from which all humans migrated. Um, it is striking to compare the Indus with the better known and more fully documented region and to see how closely the two coincide with respect to the emergence of cities and of such major concomitants of civilization as writing, standardized weights and measures, and monumental architecture. It is interesting because they seem to be hundreds of years behind, right? So there were cities in Sumer, apparently, up to 1,000 years earlier than there were cities in the Indus Valley. Why would that be? Except that some of the Sumerian cities are pre-flood, and some of the Sumerian cities are immediately after the flood, before anyone migrated. Otherwise, you would think that an area as fertile, as temperate, as nice to live in, as a valley with mountains on one side and a river running through it and an ocean for a beach, you would think this area would have been inhabited sooner. Yet nearly all the earlier writers have sensed the Indianness of the civilization even when they were largely unable to articulate it. So what happened at Babel, right? They were they were all different uh, family groups, tribal groups, if you will, but they all spoke one language. They all lived in relatively the same area, and a leader rose up and said, "Let's defy the plan of God and stay right where we are, so I can continue to rule over all of you." But God confused the languages, and this was apparently in the days of Eber because it was in his time that the earth was divided. So, several generations after the flood, now all of a sudden, people begin to move. But they come with their own language. They come with some, if you will, some of uh, the cultural knowledge of how civilization was built in the first place. They come remembering the flood. They come remembering of the stories of what was before the flood. They come remembering the Tower of Babel experience. But they have come apart because they can't speak with anyone else. They have a different language now. They come apart and they go to the Indus Valley and they begin to build cities. I don't think that the Indus Valley was populated for centuries by hunter gatherers who lived in caves, dwelt in makeshift tents or lean tos. I think that they came after the Tower of Babel, and very soon, because they already knew how, they were building cities. And that's why they suddenly seem to spring up much later than the Mesopotamian culture. So why is their Indianness so obvious? Because they were separated just enough that their culture diverged rapidly from the cultures of the Persian Gulf, of the North Persian Gulf area. So the unsolved mystery. Oh, sorry, go ahead. I think that there was very likely a population explosion, although it does seem to have settled down. You know, once the Earth reached about a half a billion people, 500 million, it stayed there until the late 1700s. And it was in the 1800s that we reached our first billion. When I was a kid, it was 4 billion. Now it's close to 8. So the it seems as though the population centers maintained because of illness, disease, famine, flood, war, war, more war. The population controls were put in place just by those factors. Um, but yeah, I think that populations did explode wherever they went. And I think God blessed them and they were fruitful and multiplied. So, from the book New Light on the Most Ancient East, 4th edition, 1952. India confronts Egypt and Babylonia by the third millennium with a thoroughly individual and independent civilization of her own, technically the peer of the rest. And plainly, it is deeply rooted in Indian soil. The Indus civilization represents a very perfect adjustment of human life to a specific environment, and it has endured. It is already specifically Indian and forms the basis of modern Indian culture. So some of the cultural differences simply come from adapting to their climate. This region is not exactly the same as it is not far away in Mesopotamia or across the way in Egypt. It's different. It's a different place to live, and that makes a different way of life. Just look at how different some parts of Mexican culture seem to the rest of North America, or how different some parts of Canada can be from most of North America and the United States. I mean, I can remember as a kid watching the what was his Speedy Gonzalez, and and he had a cousin. How many of you remember his cousin? Slowpoke Rodriguez. He talked slow, he walked slow, he napped a lot. This is a um, this is a cultural paradigm, right? This is a stereotype that we have in America, that people in Mexico and South America are lazy because they nap for 3 hours a day, right? But actually, the siesta is a necessity of the climate. It gets so hot that it's dangerous to your health to not stop in the heat of the day, go find some shade, rest, and after the sun goes down and it starts to cool off, they'll go back and work a few more hours before they head to bed. So it's not that they don't work a full day, they work more than an 8 hour day, but their culture is built around the fact that during the hottest part of the day, it's unsafe to be outside working. So they go and they find shade and they rest and then come back in the late evening and finish their work for the day. Um, that's a cultural difference, but it's if you think about it, it's a cultural acclimatization to where they live. And I think that's a lot of what shaped Indian culture so early on as being different, is that the culture was developed in the Indus Valley, and the Indus Valley is just a very different climatological zone from Mesopotamia. He said, and everybody nodded. All right. I'm trying to always keep track of the time, so I keep looking up. Um, so we still have 13 minutes. We're good to go. Um, they may have had no priests or kings at all. This is from Bauer. With or without a bureaucracy, the Harappan merchants traded their goods far afield. Harappan seals turn up in the ruins of Ur, dating from the time that Sargon controlled the city. Possibly the two civilizations first met in southeast Arabia, where both bought copper from the mines at Magan and then began their own direct trade. Ur, close to the head of the Persian Gulf, is a reasonable center for the exchange of Indian and Akkadian goods. Indian merchants could avoid the Kurthar mountain range, which blocked the northern plain, by sailing out of the Indus into the Arabian Sea, up through the Gulf of Oman, north into the Persian Gulf, and from there into the Euphrates. A Harappan trading post has been discovered at Sukkagan Dor, which lies almost within Elamite territory. Presumably, the two cultures had at least a working peace. See, it's statements like this from other historians that strengthen my belief that one of the distinctions of the Indus Valley culture was it was very much a commercial trading culture, trading with each other in the different cities, but also trading with people far away. And because their society was so built on commerce, that the only administration they really needed would have been their version of a chamber of commerce or trade guilds. Um, if that is the case, it would explain the lack of tombs for kings or anything of that nature that we find. It's also possible that once we learn to read the Indus script, we might actually learn more and not have to guess. It's entirely possible we haven't found it yet. So here's an interesting thing. They were a tidy bunch. Bauer also observes these people apparently put a high value on washing. The streets are equipped with elaborate gutter and drainage systems for wastewater. The houses are generally supplied with bathrooms, and among the most distinctive features of the large cities are the enormous swimming pool sized baths surrounded by smaller chambers, perhaps for changing clothes. Huh. And and we thought the Greeks and the Romans invented this idea. Perhaps for changing clothes. They even had privacy changing rooms, apparently. Huh. All right. Um, we don't know much about their religion at the time in the Indus Valley because we don't have the written records. But that doesn't mean they didn't have a religion, right? It just means we don't know as much about it as we do, say, Sumerian religions or Egyptian religions. Um, but it is interesting to wonder, did they want to keep the people and the city clean for religious reasons, ceremonial reasons that are cultural, non religious, or simply because they very early on figured out that if you don't keep the waste products of the human body flowing out of the city and you don't keep your garbage cleaned up, then there's a very good chance you're going to get sick and you're going to have massive disease and people are going to die. It's also possible if these cities were built primarily as trading centers, that it was simply a matter of you always want your store to be kept clean, right? If the city is basically a giant shopping mall, then you would definitely want it to be clean and shiny. All right. Silent ghosts who do not whisper. Bauer writes, most likely the pattern of daily life still varied from city to city. The spread of Harappan civilization was not exactly the ancient equivalent of an invasion by the Borg, but the similarity between such widely separated cities must have required close communication, not to mention enforcement. And even so, no messages have survived for us. During this period, the Harappan script, whatever it says, also became standardized in its form and presumably its use. Yet, it has no message for us. The cities of Harappa remain free of personality. If they are like the Borg, it is the absence of any voice who emerges as an I from the collectiveness of the Harappan experience. That's an interesting analogy. The Indus Valley civilization, the Harappan civilization, is like the Borg. Well, I think what she means is that the cities seem to be somewhat without a lot of social stratification, multiple levels of, you know, here are the priests, here are the princes, here are the wealthy aristocrats, here are the middle class businessmen, here are the poor peasants, and below them are the slaves. Um, you don't see evidence of that in the Harappan civilization as clearly as you do in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. That's not to say it didn't exist. Again, if we could read what they wrote, we might have a better idea. But from what we do see, it doesn't appear to be such a multi-tiered, stratified civilization. But there does seem to be a collectiveness to it, right? Um, they were focused on the task of producing goods, selling goods, trading for goods, and they seem to function in a very collectivist sense. Some have even speculated that this might be the earliest form of a socialist community in history. Um, Maybe, I don't know. I don't see real evidence for socialism. Um, but certainly their communities seemed to be very communal. So, uh, but it also seems that people had their own homes and they were able to produce their own goods for sale or trade with other countries. So, all right, questions and final thoughts. No one has any questions or thoughts. Well, um, really, there is no dynasty here because we have no evidence of kings. So this would be more of an era or an epoch of Indian history. But we can only be so certain. When it comes to archaeology, a lot of it is guesswork based on guesses of previous generations of archaeologists. We tend to think of the history of the world as laid out under us in strata of the dirt. Each stratum of the dirt then is a section of a time period. And in many ways, in order to find a dating system for a civilization like this one, where quite frankly, we don't understand their writing. So we can't read their records, right? What we basically do is we look at the clay pots and the metallurgy in certain strata of the earth in the Indus Valley and say, okay, so this strata appears to be this group of pottery and this group of metallurgy. And then we compare that to Harappan pottery that we find in Akkad or the Akkadian Empire and Elam and further away. And we say, okay, well, based on our timeline of Mesopotamia, they were trading for this pot during this time in Mesopotamian history. Therefore, this layer of the earth, where we find lots of this kind of pottery in the Indus Valley, must be the same time period as ancient Akkad. Somewhat speculative, somewhat guesswork. A lot of it's, we're basing assumptions on assumptions of the archaeologists who went before us. And with that, ancient history has built its house of cards. I think, generally speaking, most of the series of events, by the time you get to 3600 BC, are probably real events, and the basic storyline of civilization is probably somewhat accurate. What I have a problem with is I think they've stretched out the dates more than they should have to get to where they say the Sumerian civilization is 5,000 years old. I'm sorry, 8,000 years old, when that just seems remarkably unlikely since Adam was created much less than 8,000 years ago. Um, so that's why I say yes. There's a lot of guesswork involved. How sure are we? Was your question, and the answer is they're pretty sure, but historians are always pretty sure, even when they're wrong. Kevin, Gilbert, you guys have any interesting questions you'd like to dive into? Well, it's interesting. Incan and Mayan civilizations, we'd really like to know more about, right? We can tell they were there because we see their architecture. We can tell they were there because we see their tombs and their burial sites. But there's a whole lot about their civilizations that are guesswork. I mean, according to paleontologists in who have studied South America, they believe that the South American civilization has been there 10 to 20,000 years, which would mean that they were floating in the void of nothingness before space itself had even been created. So I find that remarkably silly. But even if you take an old Earth gap theory type position, you still have the problem of the global flood, right? Because there is no gap theory for the flood. If you look at the Septuagint chronology as the farthest back you can go, and the Masoretic text as the more standardized one, and the Sumerian Pentateuch as being the shortest one, no matter how you slice and dice it, the reality is the flood wasn't 10,000 years ago. It wasn't 20,000 years ago. It was somewhere between 3,500 years ago or 3,350 years ago ish to 4,000 to 4,500 years ago. But it's not longer than that ago, which means if there were people in the ancient Americas prior to the flood, they're dead. They died in the flood, and the Americas had to be repopulated after the flood. And there had to be time for those migrations to happen. So the answer to how many cultures are there like that? There's a lot, but it's kind of rare. By the time you get to 2000 BC, it's kind of rare not to have monuments to kings, not to see more temples, not to see more things that give us a sense of the religious and political life of a culture. In that way, the Indus Valley civilization is enigmatic. It's an enigma in history. Gilbert, do you have any questions or thoughts? I'm sorry, Gilbert, you're breaking up bad. I hope you can hear us okay. Okay. Gilbert, whatever you just said, we didn't catch it because you were breaking up really bad, but that's okay. Um, we are coming to the end of our time. I would like to go back to the map of Mesopotamia because we left Sargon dead and buried, but the Akkadian Empire, which sprang from the city of Kish, and then he built the city of Akkad, the Akkadian Empire continued after him for quite some time. And so we're going to pick up with the Sargonic dynasty and the history of the Akkadian Empire on Monday. Okay. All right, guys. I'm going to let you out a little bit early because we have completed our lesson. I will see you guys in chapel.